We had a shop in the Rue Saint-Martin where we sold work clothing wholesale, work shirts, things like that. The goods weren't confiscated, but someone was put in charge of the shop.
The police adapted themselves to their new mission as persecutors, whether or not they received orders from the occupying administration. In the summer of 1941, Germany unleashed its biggest military operation of the Second World War under the codename Barbarossa. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The riposte was immediate.
The communist resistance particularly began assassinating German officers, and the Nazis are getting more and more edgy and anxious about the presence of Jews in the occupied zone of France.
Faced with this threat, the German authorities were convinced they needed to take hostages who they could execute as reprisals for future attacks.
This was without doubt the reason for which the Germans gave the order to organize a massive roundup of foreign Jews in the heart of the French capital in August 1941.
2,400 French police, supervised by the German military police, were given the task of making the arrests. Their target, the 11th arrondissement, the neighborhood with the largest Jewish population. On August the 20th, 1941, at 5:30 in the morning, all the entrances to République and Nation metro stations were blocked.
The 11th arrondissement of Paris was sealed off by the French police. No one could go in or out without checking their ID. And this way they had a kind of dragnet and caught any Jews that were out on the street.
It was the second roundup to sweep Paris in 3 months, and the biggest ever carried out in France, in the heart of the capital. All Jewish men from 18 to 50 years old, French and foreign, who were found on the street, were arrested.
These results were disappointing, so at the end of the day on July 20th, 1941, the Paris police gave the order to go and arrest Jews in the other parts of the city.
In the end, the roundup lasted 4 days. From August 20th to 23rd, 1941, 4,232 Jews were arrested.
This roundup was hugely significant because hitherto arrests had been carried out individually. The police went to get people at their homes and brought them to the police station. It wasn't done in the full view of the general public. But here, you had an enormous police operation ordered by the Germans and carried out by the French police that took place in the middle of Paris in front of the French population at large.
After this roundup, Parisians became more aware and more concerned about what was happening to the Jews, especially as, for the first time, French nationals had been arrested. All were transported to the new internment camp at Drancy, situated a few kilometers from Paris. Four months later, on December the 12th, 1941, a third roundup was organized in Paris. This time it was carried out by German gendarmes assisted by French police. Their target was quite different.
They arrested the important people, the doctors, the lawyers, people who had been decorated with the Legion of Honor, more than 100 war veterans.
In total, 750 Jews, obtained by sifting through the famous lists. Most of them were French. Arresting this category of professionals and French nationals was considered an affront to the Vichy regime.
And this was a great shock to Vichy because it called their sovereign authority into question.
Even the General Commissar for Jewish Affairs came close to a shouting match with a German officer saying, "This operation is an aberration. You could have chosen between thousands and thousands of undesirable Jews, and instead you deliberately chose to arrest the most honorable. It's absurd. It's stupid."
Those who'd been rounded up were sent to the Royal Ure camp in Compiègne, in the Oise department north of Paris. They would remain there for 4 months. On March the 27th, 1942, the prisoners left for Auschwitz. This photo is unique. It shows the first convoy of deportees and marks the beginning of the horrific Nazi policy that was being put in place. January the 20th, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, one of Hitler's right-hand men and director of the Reich Main Security Office, convened a meeting of some 15 Nazi dignitaries in a magnificent house in Wannsee outside Berlin.
He explains to them Hitler's will that the Jews should be exterminated from Europe, and all the occupied countries must participate, and they're going to rake the Jews out of Western Europe from west to east.
At the end of the Wannsee Conference, the minutes show the number of Jews that are to be assassinated. 11 million. On the 12th line figures France and its 165,000 targeted Jews. The dignitaries also reflected upon how the final solution of the Jewish question was going to be reached.
The decision was taken to create extermination camps. It was a move towards an industrial solution, the extermination of Europe's Jewish populations.
The infernal Nazi machine was started up. A few months later, France would be one of the theatres with one of the most violent roundups ever organised. Theodor Dannecker, chief of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Service, was in charge of implementing the final solution in France. To accomplish this extermination mission, it was necessary to organize roundups on a grand scale.
But the Germans needed the French police because there was never enough German manpower, particularly after the Russian war got to be so stressful.
To lead this macabre plan to a successful conclusion, new players came to the fore in the spring of 1942. General Karl Auberg was named higher SS and police leader in France.
And his arrival coincided more or less with René Bousquet taking up the post of General Secretary of the Police in France.
He was only 33 years old, but he had ambition. By creating new police schools teaching the surveillance and identification of suspects, he wanted to show the Germans that his administration was modern and effective.
It was he who, when he first met high-ranking German officials in Paris on May 6, 1942, suggested in an aside that he could give them 10,000 foreign Jews from the Free Zone. If the German police would like to take them, the Vichy police would be happy to provide them.
One pragmatic suggestion that was in the interests of the regime.
The Vichy regime was happy and indeed eager to assist with the removal of the foreign Jews who had been the cause of their troubles in the 1930s. They've been put into camps at the outbreak of the war as foreigners at the cost of the French government.
If Vichy was ready to give the Germans a helping hand, its objective was different from that of the Reich and the final solution.
Vichy didn't want the Jews killed. That was not its aim. Vichy wanted to exclude the Jews from the civil service and from business, to rob them and ruin them.
To easily distinguish the Jews from the non-Jews, the German authorities had an idea: forcing them to wear a yellow star. The French police assured that this new decree of 29th of May 1942 was applied in the occupied zone for French and foreign Jews from the age of 6 onwards.
Dad said to Mum, "There's no way we're going to go and get that. We're leaving for the free zone." And Mum, who was very legalistic, said, "Oh, the government said so. I'll go and get it."
Joseph is a Polish Jew. He remembers the first time he left the house wearing his yellow star.
Of course, the first thing I did was to hide my star. And I felt, it's hard to find the words, like less than nothing. They wanted to convince us, and we were convinced, that we were subhuman, inferior beings.
This very stigmatizing star aroused, against all expectations, a wave of sympathy. In a gesture of solidarity, some people wore stars they made themselves, with Catholic, or Auvergnat, or Breton marked on them.
People understood that the Jew, the demonic figure of Nazi and French propaganda, wasn't necessarily this ethereal figure, but a staunch neighbor from the 3rd arrondissement. They're kids who go to school with your kids, the man mutilated in World War I that you see in the street.
The Yellow Star was not imposed on the Jews living in the free zone. Vichy had no desire to foster sympathy for the Jews. The authorities used a much more underhand method, a stamp with Jew written on it in red capital letters affixed to their identity papers. But the measures didn't stop there. In July 1942, the Jews were forbidden from entering a number of public places.
The objective was, in reality, to push bit by bit out of society the Jewish population, with German measures that were even more drastic than those put into place by Vichy.
Anti-Semitism rapidly became the norm for the entire French administration, which participated, with different degrees of zeal, in its establishment. Summer 1942. Hitler is confronted with total war. While some of his troops had just entered the Libyan town of Tobruk, others were beginning the Battle of Stalingrad in Russia. The dictator needed manpower. Before exterminating the Jews, he would use them to bolster the war effort. The demands on the French became weightier.
And suddenly, Pierre Laval, the head of the Vichy government, and its police chief, René Bousquet, were told they needed to provide straight away 40,000 Jews. So here was real pressure on Vichy, very strong pressure. General Auberg told Pierre Laval that the trains were ready to go.
July 1942. Meeting followed meeting to organize the execution of the final solution in France.
It's not just about deciding we want to deport Jews, this is how it's going to happen. You also have to think about, is there the railway material available in order to allow these deportations to happen? And then the SNCF will be required to produce the material and squeeze the trains into their timetables, which are already running and already planned.
From mid-July, 3 convoys of deportees were scheduled each week over a period of 3 months.
Ultimately, the SNCF was a cog in the wheel of the final solution. What's important to understand is that the days on which people are deported are not decided by the French railways. They are decided by ministerial meetings, by Berlin, by Vichy.
In order to attain the target of 40,000 Jews, the groups being rounded up were constantly changing.
In Theodore Danneker's mind, he had been doing the sums. It was working-age Jews, foreigners, and French. The age limit changed very quickly. First, they talked about 18 to 45, then 55, because they wanted to arrest the right number of Jews, and in order to do so, they would slide the age limit up or down.
A new twist in the horror. On July the 6th, 1942, Theodore Danneker, the chief of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Service, sent a telegram to Berlin. It carried a cruel Vichy suggestion.
President Laval proposed for the deportation of Jewish families from the non-occupied zone that they also take the children of under 16 years old. The fate of the Jewish children who remained in the occupied zone was not his business.
The head of the government wanted to send children to the camps before the Germans had even asked them to do so.
If you don't take the children as well, that means separating them from their parents, and that will appear inhuman to the non-Jewish population of France. That would lead to more protests, and he knows it.
Laval was afraid that he would have all these orphans on his hands. The French would have to feed them, and he wanted them to go with their parents.
There was also debate over the nationality of the deportees. Whether or not French Jews should be rounded up and deported along with the foreign Jews divided opinion inside the Vichy government. It was René Bousquet, the General Secretary of the Vichy Police, who was in charge of the negotiations.
So we're going to give you 40,000 Jews, but that number will only be made up of stateless Jews. And it will be the French police who will conduct operations autonomously. That was the monstrous deal dreamed up by Bousquet and approved by Marshal Pétain.
By only handing over foreign Jews and by reserving the roundup for its own police, France thought it was maintaining its sovereignty. The criteria for deportation were decided and would be applied starting on July the 16th, 1942 in Paris, for the biggest roundup of Jews ever undertaken, the Veldiv roundup. Between the 7th and 10th of July, the Gestapo worked out the fine logistical details of this gigantic operation. It convened in its offices all the heads of the different police services.
They had 25,000 forms ready for this operation. The Germans, like the French, were counting on 22,000 arrests.
Every police station received orders regarding the roundup, a list stripped of all humanity.
Operations must be carried out without unnecessary talk. There should be no discussion of their state of health. Children will also be taken. They must not be given to neighbors to look after. Animals will be given to the guardian.
As for the place where these people would be brought, it would be the Velodrome d'Hiver, the winter cycling stadium, situated a few hundred meters from the Eiffel Tower.
They had to find a place to put 12 or 15,000 Jews, and so they chose this bicycle stadium, which is called the Velodrome d'Hiver. And it's called for short the Veldiv.
As for childless adult Jews, they were sent directly to the camp at Drancy, a few kilometers from Paris.